is Kelly Tebow, and I'm with the New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders. I will be your organizer this evening and would like to welcome you to our webinar on bullying. Thank you all for joining us. Tonight's presentation has been condensed from a full day's worth of presentation material to accommodate our time frame with Q&A afterwards. Expanded topics, including material on the nature of bullying, is available on the NJ Coalition bullying website, www.njbullying.org. We will do our best to address as many questions as possible this evening while keeping to our allotted schedule. If you have more questions or would like to continue the discussion, Dr. Green will be available for the next week to answer questions on our webinar chat board at www.njcts.org. Answers will be archived for future reference. All participants are muted, so during the course of the webinar, if you have a question, there is a place on your screen panel to type any question you may think of during the presentation. We will be answering questions at the end of the webinar. If you missed part of the presentation or would just like to hear it again, an archived version will be posted to the website shortly. When you exit the webinar, there will be a brief exit survey that we would like you to fill out. The New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, NJCTS, and its directors, employees assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, objectivity, or usefulness of information presented on our site. We do not endorse any recommendation or opinion made by any member physician, nor do we advocate for any treatment. You are responsible for your own medical decisions. A fuller version of this webinar is available to you by request. Now I'm going to turn over the introductions of our speaker to Martha Butterfield, the Program Coordinator of NJCTS. Marty?
Thank you, Kelly, and good evening, everybody. I'd like to introduce our presenter tonight, Dr. Stuart Green. Dr. Green is a behavioral scientist and the founder and director of the New Jersey Coalition for Bullying Awareness and Prevention. Dr. Green founded the coalition more than 10 years ago following the Columbine incident. At that time, there was no organization in New Jersey which networked and encouraged nonprofit and governmental organizations to address the problem of bullying. Now there are about 30 organizations involved with the coalition, including the New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome. The coalition not only holds regular meetings during which experts present information on bullying, but they also offer a volunteer-assisted hotline that offers help and information to parents and schools. In addition to his work with the coalition, Dr. Green is the Associate Director of the Family Medicine Residency Program at Overlook Hospital, Atlantic Health System in Summit, New Jersey. He is also Clinical Instructor of Family Medicine at Mount Sinai Medical School, or rather Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York. Now that kids are back to school, we think that this is a very timely subject for our webinar series, so it is with great pleasure that I turn tonight's presentation over to Dr. Green.
Thanks very much, Marty, and to you, Kelly, and also to the New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and its founder, Faith Rice, for this opportunity to talk with you about bullying. And there is a short amount of time to cover a lot of material. More may come up during questions and answers. So I'm going to go right to the start, which is a focus on what to do about the problem. And to move this, okay. So first, about 40 years ago in Norway, 3 preteen children killed themselves, all within a short period of time. And the equivalent of a psychological autopsy that was done, including newspaper investigations and so forth, revealed that all 3 children had been severely and persistently bullied in school. The Norwegian government, which controls the schools in Norway, writes a central curriculum, etc., sought help from a psychologist, a young professor at the University of Bergen, Dan Olveus is the way it's pronounced, to do something about the problem. And Olveus responded that academics such as himself and clinicians didn't know much about bullying or know exactly how to address it, especially before incidents occurred, in other words, to prevent it. And that was true. Ulvaeus then took up the government's challenge, began investigating childhood bullying, and created a very successful public health intervention, which has helped many children since then. Now, this was 40 years ago, and Ulvaeus's work, which has been well replicated by numerous studies over the past 40 years, challenged a lot of the prevailing myths, which we'll go into in a minute. But some of the most important key points of Ulvaeus's work was that he found that school was the most common site for bullying. Now, this was already shattering a myth that had been held for hundreds, thousands of years prior to the beginning of Ulvaeus's work. Prior to Ulvaeus, it was widely or universally believed that bullying is a phenomenon that arose from bad kids, bad families, and bad communities, and sort of leaked its way over into the innocent confines of schools. And in fact, Ulvaeus found when he did the first systematic studies of this issue, and again, this work has been replicated in multiple countries, including the U.S. Over the last 40 years, that most bullying occurs in schools. In fact, the bullying that occurs in schools often leaks its way back out into the community. A notable example of that is in terms of gang activity. Bullying, harassment, and intimidation in schools is a major means of gang recruitment and maintenance. So schools is the most common site for bullying. Advocates sort of half joke about this as the Willie Sutton rule. He used to say that he robbed banks because that's where the money is. And it only seems common sense now to say that schools is where bullying occurs because that's where the kids are. But again, this was a groundbreaking work at the time Ulvaeus did it. And in Ulvaeus's model, you address bullying by changing the culture of schools. The culture of the school is usually thought of as the way things are done here in this school, in this building. And culture gives rise to climate, which is the way the school feels to the children in it and to those who visit it. And the most important point is the last one on this slide, which is that interventions to impact bullying have to be initiated and led by adults. Bullying is seen as a problem created in children by adults through adult modeling of bullying behavior in their relationships with kids and with each other, fear-based and power-based, if not violent relationships, through inadequately addressing bullying in action when it occurs, and that communicates to children, especially implicit acceptance of bullying as a normal, developmentally normal and inevitable aspect of childhood and children. Boys will be boys, girls are mean, the usual, all the sayings you've heard about bullying. Let's go to the next slide, Kelly. Okay. Interventions for bullying need to occur on multiple levels concurrently, and this is why we refer to the intervention model as a systemic or whole school model. And the three levels, and these are covered in 3 slides here, are the level of the whole school, the level of the classroom, and the level of the individual. And I'll go through these and a little bit quickly, but maybe through questioning we can explore some more of it. But these are major aspects of what needs to go on the level of the whole school. This is a hierarchical process. That is, the principal of the school, most importantly, needs to get how important this issue is, that this is the most common serious problem of the school-age child. We know that from multiple surveys that have been done for 40 years in at least 14 countries, including the U.S., in which children are asked to say what it is that's the biggest concern for them in attending a new school or in being in school, and consistently identify harsh treatment by peers, the anticipation of it or the experience of it as their major problem. So there has to be, the principal has to understand the importance of this, and be committed to addressing it in an ongoing way, and that's part of what's meant by administrative support. That support enables a coordinating group which to work, and there has to be one, and most critically, it has to include teachers. Even though all adults or representatives of adult groups in the school, cafeteria to coaches to security, have to be involved in this effort. Teachers are the most important constituency, studies have shown. In fact, when there have been systemic or whole school interventions that have not worked or produced positive results, analysis after the fact has consistently indicated that lack of sufficient effort to get teachers in the school on board and lack of sufficient buy-in by teachers is the major barrier to why an intervention didn't work. There are some other barriers, but that's a major one. There has to be assessment of bullying in the school, and this is an issue that we've fallen down on not only in New Jersey but all over the country. There's very inadequate assessment of the extent of bullying in schools. We just don't have the kind of data that allows us to compare one school to another or compare schools over a timeline before and after intervention. So there's that. Positive staff-to-staff relationships means that children have to see teachers acting as if they like each other and get along. This is a concept therapists are very familiar with. Children don't really care whether adults in their lives, even parents, sort of really get along or have intimate relationships, but they want to see polite and respectful relations, what therapists call the good enough parent, and that applies to teachers and staff in school as well. And there has to be positive staff-student relations, and we can talk some more about that. But there has to be a sense of warmth and welcoming of students. There's actually a model responsive classroom that has some elements in it that are very good for anti-bullying efforts. And one of those elements is one in which all children are welcomed to school every morning by a wide array of staff who, in addition to the metal detector or the security guard or what the normal entry is to school, essentially welcome each child to school with the child's name or some brief positive comment. And that can be very powerful for anti-bullying efforts. There has to be some effort to identify incidents and relationships. We use the word relationships because bullying is typically a pattern of negative acts, not just one terrible act. In fact, when there is one terrible incident of bullying and you investigate, it almost always is the case that that child who's been hurt has been hurt before by those same children or by others, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, without it being inadequately addressed. We get several calls a week from parents on the coalition phone line, and most of the time, those parents are reporting months or sometimes a year or more of incidents, even though they're calling because something specific has just happened. This proactive effort to identify incidents and relationships is important. It means that a school really needs to make an effort to identify the children who are isolated, who are vulnerable, or who have been hurt, for example, in a previous school. When a child transfers from an elementary school to a middle school, for example, there has to be a specific effort made to see whether in that elementary school they're transferring from, they were isolated, vulnerable, or hurt, and the school needs to have that knowledge in order to adequately support them and protect them. There has to be a supervision of high-risk areas, and the common ones are listed there, and there has to be consistent rules and consequences for bullying that are well known, and parents have to be much more involved than they are and have to have a role in this in the school. And there's this notion of bystanders. Most kids in a school at any given moment are not either hurting or being hurt, but are bystanders, and some of those are supporting the bullying, laughing at some cruel jokes would be one example. Others are more sort of passive, observing or witnessing what's going on, knowing about it. and others are would be willing to be helpful to the hurt child or to intervene, but they have to be supported by adult efforts. Otherwise, we're essentially turning over the problem to kids to deal with themselves. And that's not only not right, but it's not effective. Next slide, please, Kelly. On a classroom level, there needs to be, again, that sense of how we operate here in the classroom in terms of relationships and support we provide each other. There have to be regular meetings, another very good idea from the responsive classroom model that works well for anti-bullying efforts. This point about collaborative learning models, all teachers are familiar with collaborative learning, developed by Elliot Aronson, one of this century's most important psychologists. There's over 50 years of work by Aronson and his students and followers showing that when kids work collaboratively to learn, you get no drop-off in individual academic achievement, and you get a tremendous uptick in social relations between kids. Now, even though all schools do some collaborative learning, the extent to which that model is used is very underplayed, and doing more collaborative learning would be important for anti-bullying efforts. Ideally, addressing bullying needs to occur in all the classes, math to social studies, and not be sort of isolated to health class. So across all subjects, some focus on this, on the way minority populations have been stigmatized and hurt, for example. The math class can help with surveys and assessment. English can do the 100 Dresses or the many other books that are available at different levels that are about bullying. And again, proactive work on relationships. The teachers really have to, and aides have to be paying attention to who's isolated in the class and who's a target, and not go incident by incident, but assume that there's probably a pattern of this over significant amounts of time. And again, more parent involvement whenever possible. Next slide, please, Kelly. On the individual level, you want to, again, have this proactive information gathering on vulnerability. And an example of that is every year, at a minimum in schools, there's sort of a sign-up process for kids to join clubs or groups. And at the end of that, you have what researchers would consider a database. You can identify all the kids in a school who are involved in absolutely nothing, who belong to no clubs and are involved in no school activities. And that's a state of disengagement that we know from multiple studies puts kids at risk not only for not graduating and poor academic achievement, but for high vulnerability to being hurt, being bullied. And the fact is that if you identify 10, in some schools it's more, as much as 20% of kids who are not engaged in school in that way, there needs to be a very active, one example would be a mentoring process that really assigns staff to one or a few kids to get to know that kid more over the course of the year, and the successful outcome would be to have that kid engaged in a school activity. Engagement is actually usually defined as, on a kid level, is the extent to which you ask a kid whether they can specifically identify one or more adults in the school who know them as a person and care about them. And there's a certain percentage of kids who can't answer that question. That's a disengaged child. But on a behavioral level, it's a child who's not involved in school activities, and that's a high-risk state that needs to be addressed. When incidents occur, there has to be a meeting with each child individually who was hurt, and the parent needs to be called if not met with. And the most important thing the school needs to do is to apologize, really, to say that we regret that this happened on our watch, and your child certainly didn't deserve this. And we're not perfect, we're only human, but we intend to address this and to support your child and to do the best we can to protect them and resolve and provide redress. The fact is, when I get calls from parents or others do, and we say to them, look, this is a terrible thing that's occurred. Your child didn't deserve this, and I'm sorry this happened to you. There are parents who cry at that point on the phone because that's the first time they've gotten that message, and that's That's not acceptable. There also have to be meetings with each of the children who bullied, not together. If you meet with them together, you get sort of prison dynamics. They support and bond with each other. But you meet with them individually, and we can talk more about the 4 questions process, which I'd attribute to Stan Davis, the great anti-bullying advocate. But the fact is that you need to meet with each child who bullied, and you have to talk about it. But in addition to talking about it, you have to provide consequences for them. And those consequences have to be reasonable. It can't be right to suspension or expulsion, except if the offense is so egregious it requires that. And there has to be a rubric of consequences. Teachers are familiar with rubrics, meaning the first incident, this happens. The second incident, that happens. Typically withdrawal of privileges. And then after the consequences have to be applied to every child who bullies. The minute consequences are not applied because a child is favored, or a child is otherwise great, or a child's family is very involved in the school, it's an immense corrosive to anti-bullying efforts. And after the incident is addressed in this way, there has to be an opportunity for the child who bullied to reflect on what they did. Again, the 4 questions process is very helpful to that. And there has to be an opportunity to recognize a change in their behavior if it occurs, and for that to be noticed and affirmed and supported. More support for the bullied child and monitoring, so that an incident is not over after the consequence has been applied and there's some reflective process for the bullying child. There really has to be monitoring after incidents. In fact, whenever an incident occurs or comes to the school's attention, the school, the safety or climate team in the school, the coordinating group, should take it as a trigger for taking a look at the school's culture and climate and see whether it was strong enough, whether the child who was hurt belongs to some high risk or vulnerable or minority group, and whether the school is being active enough in supporting those identities or that diverse identity. Next slide, Kelly. These are examples of some measures we already talked about that help. I mentioned the collaborative learning models. Friendship circles is a very powerful intervention. It basically means that an adult in the school reaches out to some peer leaders or kids to befriend and support an isolated or vulnerable child. And this is another vastly underutilized and important method. Having friends is the #1 buffer for kids who are vulnerable or hurt. And the feeling always is, well, you know, this is artificial, or the kid's being asked to befriend a child won't do it, or the kid who's being befriended won't want it because it's not natural. And lots of experience in schools has shown that none of that is true. Kids who are asked by adults as part of a good culture and process to befriend vulnerable or isolated children are typically perfectly willing to do it and do it well. And kids who are befriended in that way value what then happens in their life. We talked about the mentoring to strengthen engagement. This diverse clubs and activities issue is another important part of supporting kids at risk. Bullying is a huge issue, for example, for the LGBT community, kids that are lesbian and gay and transgendered, or even questioning and exploring gender identity. And yet most schools have no official activities that support and affirm those identities. Gay Straight Alliance clubs, participation in Day of Silence. These are not things that happen in all schools, and that's an example of something that needs to happen. Diversity education. We did a program recently with teenagers who, with Tourette's who talked eloquently about how incredibly important and helpful it was at the point at which in their schools there was educational activity for the children and communication to parents in the school about what Tourette's syndrome is and what a change that made. And there needs to be that kind of thing. You take it for granted that there are children who are lesbian and gay and transgender in a school, and there needs to be some proactive education about those issues. Certainly in a school in which most of the staff is white and a large part of the student body is African American, or even a minority of the school is, there needs to be proactive diversity education that addresses those issues. Again, we talked about the staff-student positive relations and staff-staff positive relations. Next slide, please. Kelly. Thank you.
Slight delay.
The next 3 slides are basically what parents can do. And I want to precede this by saying that parents are really pretty limited, despite the fact that there are 3 slides, in addressing this issue. Most bullying arises and occurs in schools, and parents are limited in direct actions they can take to address this. You know, there's a phrase in loco parentis, meaning that while children are in school, the schools have a sort of parental a role to play. And it's really the school teachers and administrators who need to address bullying. Nonetheless, these 3 slides have things that are helpful for parents to do. Ideally, there's some good relationships with the children in a family, some open communication with them. That's very helpful at the point at which incidents occur or a child is in a relationship that's hurting them. Parents should inform themselves, ideally before the fact. There's over 100 pages of material on the njbullying.org website and links to there to hundreds of pages more that are well recommended and vetted. Expecting that schools address this critically important issue, and even in, for example, with cyberbullying, most of the cyberbullying that takes place, electronic forms of bullying, occurs on social networking sites, and those are sites that are owned by companies and people that make a great deal of money from children and adults' participation in those sites. And the owners of those sites can be expected to do a much better job of screening for content and noticing things and helping parents and kids address these issues when they arise. And actually, there are attorneys generals across the country that are starting to expect this of Facebook and MySpace and FormSpring, and taking some positive actions in that regard. Ann Milgram, the former Attorney General of New Jersey, was a leader on this, and there are others doing this. When you're with your child, asking how children are treating other children at school, and listening is more important than advice. Kids who are being hurt especially are thinking about this issue all the time, day and night. And it's rare that the parent's going to be able to give a piece of advice that's going to solve this for a kid. At the same time, listening to the child is tremendously helpful and provides some opportunity for thinking about this with the child. That's better than just leaping into action and giving advice. And much of the advice that adults give, including parents, to a child really doesn't work, and the child knows it. There's no evidence that joining a karate class is going to solve this issue for a child who's being hurt. And at the same time, advice to ignore it. If a child can do that, it's very hard to do. To walk home in a different way. These are all to use humor when you're being hurt. These are very difficult things to carry out, no matter how much role-playing is done. Next slide, please. If you're with your child in a group of children and they're denigrating another child, you need to say something about that and express some empathy for the child that they're talking negatively about. Again, parents need to be in a school. After 3rd or 4th grade in this country, parents start to disappear from schools, and the rationale is that the kids wouldn't want them there or the parents don't want to be involved. Schools need to make a much more active effort to create a role for parents and get them there. But parents themselves, if they're able, harder these days, the way everybody's working, but there are parents who can be involved, and they need to be. And taking action with other concerned parents. I'm always astonished at the number of schools in which parents of kids with special educational or health needs don't have organizations in which they get together with other parents. And when it comes to addressing bullying, that's a critical and very important thing that parents can do. Next slide. Is there what's the next, Kelly? And this is the last one. Every time any adult has walked by a schoolyard in which 3 or 4 kids are on one, or walked by a situation, I'm not saying to run in like the bad stranger and physically address it, but to report it, to feel as if and act as if one were witnessing a mugging taking place, and to expect, especially if it's taking place in a school, for that to be addressed. I'll skip to the legal advice and support one. Certainly for any bias-based bullying, bullying based on race, and excuse me, I just got locked out of the computer for a second. There we are. For any child who's experiencing bias-based bullying, bullying based on other children's perception that they're gay, for example, or don't fit a male or female, masculine or feminine stereotypes, bullying based on race, ethnicity, disability, etc. In New Jersey, the Division on Civil Rights is a very good resource, and parents should seek that out. There's information about that on our website. And if there are coaches, or occasionally there are teachers, a minority, of course, a small minority who use denigrative or humiliating methods with students, and that has to be changed. If administrators or others are aware of teachers who bully, and there are studies that show that there are some who do, that has to be addressed as an urgent matter. It's an immense corrosive to anti-bullying efforts. And of course, as a last resort, and most parents can't afford to do this financially or otherwise, but changing schools is sometimes works. I'll end with one hopeful note, at least for this section, which is the nature of childhood is changed. So kids do grow out of this on both ends. More often, kids who are being hurt sometimes stop being hurt. And sometimes kids who bully, but less so, stop engaging in that behavior. So change is possible. But at the same time, being bullied creates lasting traumatic effects for most kids who experience it, including increased rates of anxiety and depression in adulthood, and lots of other effects we can perhaps talk about if there's a question about it. Let's go to the next slide. Kelly. Yep. And this is just one slide for professionals, doctors, and others out in the community, if there are any on the line, in terms of addressing this issue. Just being alert for bullying as a factor. For example, kids who are bullied or even very concerned about it, or have many more visits, studies have shown, to doctors for diffuse kinds of complaints, diffuse abdominal complaints, and other things, and physicians have to be alert to the possibility that bullying is a factor and ask specifically about it. And the same thing for other professionals who work with kids, and the rest of the factors we sort of went to. I just want to go into and advocating for stronger law. One of the coalition's priorities the last couple of years has been working towards getting stronger law in New Jersey, and that's happening all over the country. And I'm very hopeful that that's going to occur. But let's just go to the last piece, which is what doesn't work. First, to just affirm again that even though the methods so far developed are far from perfect, this is a pretty new field, only about 10 years. It's a tragedy-driven field. If it wasn't for Columbine, April 20th, 1999, we wouldn't even be here talking about this issue in the U.S., I believe. We certainly weren't before. And 30 or 40 years of work in the world, it's not a long time for this level of an issue. So there's a lot that we don't know. But nonetheless, when these approaches are put into place, you can drop bullying incidents in the first year 20 to 50% in some cases, maybe not 50, but in the 20s more often. And that's a dramatic drop in an important problem. And you see italicized there that you can keep getting improvements if the effort is ongoing. This can't be the flavor of the month or the flavor of the year. It's got to be recognized for the important problem it is and addressed ongoing all the time. And there's a good reason for doing that. So much effort is put into teaching to the test and this emphasis on raising test scores. And the fact is we have several years' worth of studies now that show that if you adequately address bullying in a school, test scores will go up as if they're rockets. And that's because the states of tension in kids that arise in a school that inadequately addresses this issue are very impairing for academic performance. Kids who are great academically are going to do okay anyway, but the majority of kids are not functioning as well as they could if they're distracted by fears about violence or even the experience of it. So that's this slide. And next, and this is the last one or next to last one, we have to be clear about what doesn't work. I get calls occasionally from principals who start out by telling me that they have zero tolerance in their school for violence, and the principal may not realize it, but saying that is equivalent to saying that bullying is not being understood or adequately addressed in that school. There have been lots of studies, a big American Psychological Association task force report of a couple of years ago that shows that zero tolerance policies do not work. They don't work at all. In fact, they're harmful. The reason they don't work is because in schools that have zero tolerance policies, and this has been shown, those harsh, overly harsh penalties, suspension, expulsion for a first offense, no matter what it is, a kid holding their finger out in a gesture as if it was a weapon, let alone for bullying offenses, are disproportionately applied to minority populations, populations of color or minority ethnicity in a school. So zero tolerance is really a disparity phenomenon more than it's a helpful phenomenon. Social skills training and therapy are wonderful things. I have years of doing them myself with kids and adults. They're very effective methods. But when you do social skills training with kids who bully, especially in a group together, the method works. You end up with increased empathy and other social skills in the kids you're doing this method with. But if they go back to an environment in which bullying is inadequately addressed, they become more effective at hurting other kids using their new powers of empathy and interpersonal skills. Peer mediation and conflict resolution, I just want to say, absolutely are not indicated and do not work for bullying. These are wonderful methods, these things, for conflict that's not bullying. But you don't use peer mediation for bullying. It's like using peer mediation for mugging, bringing the person who got mugged and the person who mugged them together to do counseling at a point at which the person who did the mugging doesn't even admit that they did anything wrong to begin with. It's like doing couples counseling to improve communication skills in a couple in which the one partner is getting repeatedly beat up by the other partner. It's just an inappropriate method to use. And one-shots, just doing an assembly or doing some short-term kind of thing without a deep home growing of an ongoing intervention in the school does not work. We've actually had some reports from kids that after one-shot assemblies, when they go back out into school corridors that aren't adequately controlled for violence, sometimes they get hurt more the week after than they were hurt the week before, because it's a demonstration by adults that there isn't a program in place, and this is just the assembly program that we're doing once a year as sort of required. Next slide is this one, a very important quote from Dan Olveus, which is the moral obligation to help bully children, and we're still not doing it adequately. Again, I just like to end by saying that I flew through that. This is normally an hour and a half to a whole day with a lot more slides, a minimum of 25, and we just did 12. So nonetheless, let's go to questions and see if we can talk about some more if there's interest.
Stuart, thank you. That was
Sure.
a lot of information, and I know that you had to consolidate it into a very short window, so I appreciate it, and we have some really good questions.
Okay.
I want to start with one that came up about your comment about changing schools. The question is, why should I, it was the last resort comment. Why should I change schools? Isn't there a law against bullying? So why should a parent be in a position of having to change school for their child?
The answer is the parent should not have to be in that position at all. It's outrageous that a parent should have to, change a school. But the fact is that this issue is not yet being adequately addressed in most schools. And if a child is being hurt, and there's some opportunity to have the child not be hurt in a way that potentially affects their, them lifelong in some way, it's reasonable to consider that as a last option. I'm not urging parents to go out and change schools, and I absolutely agree. It's unfair and terrible that a parent should have to do that. But if your child is being hurt and that's an option that's available, in fact, changing schools doesn't always work. Over the last 10 years, 12 years at this point, I've certainly occasionally had a report from a parent who changed schools, and the kids that were doing the bullying communicated with other kids at the new school, or some vulnerability that was fixed on, not causing the bullying, but focused on in the old school becomes focused on in the new school, and the child is still bullied in the new school. I agree with the parent who asked that question, but nonetheless, anything that one can do to help. The comment about law, by the way, New Jersey was one of the first. There were only 20 states in the U.S. that had laws addressing bullying at the time that Senator Bono and others created New Jersey's anti-bullying law in 2002, which went into effect in 2003. And there's now been 2 other laws in New Jersey, but the fact is that both here in New Jersey and in the country, the laws are not yet strong enough, and we very much need stronger law and stronger support for schools to help address this issue, and more options for parents as well, more rights, more options.
Okay, thank you.
Let's go to the next, yeah.
There are 2 questions here that are fairly similar, 2 different parents. In one instance, the parent is saying that she's been at school 6 times since the beginning of the year, including the Board of Education.
Yep.
And her child is being isolated.
Yep.
And in another instance, the parent is saying the school knows about it, which is pretty clear from that first one, and they refuse to do anything. So what kind of advice could you give both those parents who have a very similar problem?
It's very frustrating. This comes up in calls all the time. If I were on the phone individually with those parents, and by the way, they're welcome to call the coalition line, and often they'll get me on the phone or I'll call back. But I would ask them that when they've been to the school, have they been alone or have they gone with others? This may sound not serious on my part, but I actually suggest to parents sometimes the ideal is to go in and deal with the school with other parents with you, which is why it's so important for parents to, be part of organizations or groups that can address this collectively or in an organized way. But if a parent is alone and just has their own family members, I recommend that they go in with family members, take an in-law, take a sibling for support for you and to make notes and to help you remember what questions to ask. So there are processes for engaging with the school that can be helpful. I also always ask the parent whether there's any possibility the bullying is bias-based or directed against their child based on the perception of their child's learning difference or health difference or gender identity and expression or so forth, or race or culture, ethnicity, and so forth, because in that case it's possible to get some help from the Attorney General's office in the form of the Division on Civil Rights. Right now, in New Jersey, we have a legal environment in which private lawyers will only take a bullying case, if it's tremendously egregious, very hurt, a lot of damage has been done. And the other thing is if the family can pay, if they can afford it, because so far lawyers are not taking these cases on a contingency basis. But if a family can enlist a lawyer as an ally or an advocate for them, sometimes that's helpful. Again, I'll stop at this point.
Okay, but touching on that just again. So if you were a parent and your child was being bullied, would you say that you should try and go with parents who also have kids being bullied?
Yes.
Would that reinforce your position? Or
yes,
would it be better to bring, a family member or an advocate of some kind?
No. The absolute ideal is what you just said. The absolute ideal, I tell parents, I say, if you can find other parents who are unhappy about this issue, just give yourself a name from the phone book. Call yourself the ad hoc committee in such and such a town to protect our children, and then go in and schedule a meeting together with the principal or with the superintendent. There also, by the way, is a pathway that extends beyond the district superintendent. And the Department of Education has certainly not done enough yet to publicize this to all the parents in New Jersey. You're supposed to go first to the principal if you're not satisfied within whatever time frame you consider okay. You're not satisfied to then go to the district superintendent. If you're not satisfied there, you're supposed to go to the county or regional superintendent, which in effect is the same as going to the State Department of Education. You can also call the State Department of Education in Trenton directly. There actually is a unit called Safe and Drug-Free Schools, if I have that name exactly right, and talk to the staffer there. You can also appeal to the Commissioner of Education, and ultimately you can reach an administrative law judge to get some decision on your behalf. All of that without a lawyer.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Have another question about an incident where this young girl has been cyberbullied and bullied outside of school initially. The school states that it did not happen on school grounds, so it's not their problem.
Yeah,
but the problem did carry over into school. So what is the school's responsibility?
I would say on moral grounds alone, and hopefully soon on legal grounds as well, schools are absolutely obligated, but not yet in law, to address these issues outside of school. The idea that cyberbullying is some phenomenon that's only happening outside the school and therefore is not the school's responsibility is both ridiculous and an outrage. The fact is that studies have shown, it's a new phenomenon, but so far we have some good studies that clearly show that most of the electronic forms of bullying that take place, supposedly not connected to the school, actually relate to in-building bullying. That most of the cyberbullying that takes place is not being done by strangers from across the continent or the globe. It's an extension of what's happening in the school.
It's and the kid in the next seat.
Yeah, and the fact is that if the school looked at the issue in an adequate way, they would find the relationships in which this is taking place. This notion of complete anonymity on the web or electronically is somewhat of a myth. And you can identify these things, and the school needs to take responsibility for addressing these things. The language that hopefully will be used in new law is language that says that schools are responsible for addressing these things when the bullying, be it cyberbullying or not, substantially and materially negatively impacts the student or the school. And the fact is that almost all cyberbullying substantially and negatively impacts the students in that school and is occurring between them. So schools need to take responsibility for addressing this. And parents shouldn't accept that for an answer, but of course, you know, other than being taxpayers and citizens and so forth, parents are limited, understood.
In that case, the parent went on to say that, you know, that only made matters worse. And in the same kind of context, there was another question about reporting the bully because there is fear of retaliation. So making matters worse and retaliation, would you talk about those a little bit?
Sure. I actually had a question. When the parent says made it worse, what do they mean? But I guess I should just answer without...
Well, she may further address that question. If she'd like to send me another question, I'll include it. But she said the parent went for help, and in our case, it only made matters worse. So she didn't elaborate beyond that. But the retaliation and that kind of a problem, how would you address that?
It often is a problem. But typically, the retaliation is a problem because the school is not doing adequate after-the-fact monitoring. In other words, taking a legal sort of a legalistic, I would say, perspective on these issues, which is often what schools do. They treat it as if it was sort of a court of law process, and you just relate to one incident, and then the incident is over. But in fact, the incident typically indicates something ongoing, typically something that's existed before this incident came to the school's attention. And the school needs to be very active after an incident is reported to try in every way to be protective of the students who got hurt, to assume that they're at some risk, and to also take a look at the student who did the hurting, and that would help a lot. Part of the problem with retaliation is that parents and the kids feel so isolated and also feel like they almost have to wait for another incident to be reported in order to engage the school in supportive and protective action.
So the school should be stepping up more after this incident. Beyond trying to handle the incident, they should be proactive in preventing a reoccurrence.
In every way. In fact, I said this before, but this is a good opportunity to reiterate it. When bullying occurs, when an incident comes to the awareness of a school, and again, it's almost a failure when a school first hears about an incident from a kid or a parent, because typically there's been a pattern of such acts and in a child who's isolated or vulnerable in some way that hasn't been adequately noticed. But when an incident does come to the attention of the school, the incident should be used as a trigger by the school to take a deep look at the issue. Does that child belong to a minority, group in some way? Is there a vulnerability? Is there a level of support that as a school we have not provided? Is there some gap in our culture, some missing element in the climate of the school such that this student was victimized or the kid who bullied them felt like this was something that was acceptable to do in this school? Have we adequately addressed the bystander kids so that this kid doing the bullying is clearly an outlier and not getting the support of other kids? And now that an incident's occurred, we need to keep taking a look at this issue. And yes, I like your word, step up. The school needs to step up in a very significant way.
Well, going back to that same situation that we talked about before about making matters worse, the parent went on the individual on the webinar said that the school knew about the bullying, continued even to this year to allow the students in the same classes sit next to the child. Never informed the teachers that the parent had to. So it's just, it made the child afraid to go to activities because there was nothing done.
It's almost like, believe me, I've been hearing these calls several times a week or more for the last 12 years. And even just as somebody who listens to these things, it's traumatizing. Therapists actually have a word for that. They call it vicarious traumatization. It's very upsetting to hear what the parent is describing. But what that parent is describing sounds like, take what I'm saying with a grain of salt in fairness to schools and educators who have a hard job to do, for sure, and not knowing the school, so I don't mean to attack that particular school. But parents don't lie about these things when they describe them. And what it sounds like that parent is describing is a school that is not adequately addressing the most common form of suffering and violence that there is in school-age children. And what's the excuse for that? I don't know if I answered the question especially, but that's my response to what the parent is saying. It's
okay, well,
it's inappropriate.
It is, and thank you for spending so much time on that particular topic, but I think it's very pertinent. I have a question about the Open Circle program, and this individual is asking if you are familiar with it and what you know about it. What's your opinion?
Not by that term. I mean, if I had a second, I could Google it, and then maybe I'd know, what it refers to. Maybe it's called by some other names. I would need the parent to just provide a half a sentence to say what it is.
All right. Well, if we have time and that parent can do that, we'll come back to that question.
Okay.
If we don't run out of time.
Yeah.
I have a question about just bullies in general. How do children become bullies, and have they been bullied themselves? Is there any evidence along those lines?
There is some. This is one of these areas that we need to study more about as we go along. I'm actually in dialogue at the moment with a psychologist in New York about this very issue. The fact is that, as I said in one of, we didn't do the early slides, so we didn't see this. But as one of the other slides would have said, there is some evidence that kids who bully have a somewhat more pathology in some cases. But the fact is, those are group characterizations in those studies. In other words, if you had 100 kids who bullied a lot in this corner of the room and 100 kids who never bully in that corner of the room, and you compare the two groups, you'll find some characteristics more present in the kids doing the bullying. Somewhat more alcohol and drug and tobacco use, somewhat lower academic performance than they're capable of. For example, what's called authoritarian parenting. The people in the audience may know that from a psychologist's point of view, parenting comes in three flavors: authoritarian, permissive, and authoritative. And authoritarian is all rules and no warmth. Permissive, of course, is all warmth and no rules, and authoritative is a nice blend of the two.
Somewhere in the middle.
And yes, somewhere in the middle, a state I don't consistently reach in my own parenting. But the fact is that there is somewhat more of an authoritarian parenting background and somewhat more parent and sibling sort of conflicts and bullying at home in kids who bully the most. However, and this is a huge but, most kids who bully, you cannot identify significant individual or family psychopathologies in them. And the fact is that even if you have those psychopathologies, let's take the most extreme example, a small minority of kids. Take kids who have antisocial personality disorder, and there are some kids unfortunately born that way, called sociopathy or antisocial personality disorder. Kids like that will have more of a propensity to violence and manipulation, aggressive behavior, etc. But the fact is, it's the difference between having a propensity or predisposition for something and then turning that into an expressed behavior. And whether even a kid in that category will express that kind of behavior depends primarily on the social environment that they find themselves in. I mean, there are people with antisocial personality disorder who are running big corporations in this country, in some cases, and behaving, pretty normally. Social environment means a lot. So there's no definitive answer to that question at the moment. But if you address the social environment factors, the way a school is run, the culture and climate of it, you will prevent and adequately address most of the bullying that takes place. On the other hand, if you adopt an individual psychopathology model where you spend all your energy focusing on kids who have discernible pathology and providing them with therapy or counseling or sort of addressing these things on some individual level, you will not take care of most of the bullying, most of the hazing, most of the sexual harassment, most of the sexual assault, most of the exclusion, the isolation, all the different ways that kids are hurt. You will not address most of that stuff by using an individual psychopathology model. So again, I don't know if that's an adequate answer for what the parent or whoever was raising, but that's a point of view about it.
Okay. Have a question about the 4 questions process, and wondered if you could spend a few minutes talking about that.
Yeah, I'll do it in a minute or so. The best book that I know of on bullying, and there's been a ton of them, and new ones come out, it seems like every month, is a book by Stan Davis called Schools Where Everyone Belongs. He's written another book since then, but it basically repeats what's in that first book. Schools Where Everyone Belongs by Stan Davis. You can get it on Amazon for, I don't know, $15 or used probably for $2. I don't make any money from it, by the way, though I endorse it. And Davis is the one who most laid out this 4 questions process, but some version of it is routinely used in these programs. And basically what it means is that when a kid has bullied and you call them in to talk with them about it, the first thing, of course, you do ideally is you make them wait a minute while you finish whatever work is on your desk, and while they're waiting, you have them go to the wall over on the side and look themselves up on the rubric that should be posted there and posted all over the school. All teachers know rubrics. It's like a box, it's like a chart with boxes. First offense gets you this consequence. Second offense gets you that consequence. First offense where you sent the kid to the hospital gets you this, offense. I'm joking, of course. But that's what a rubric is. And you can have a kid look themselves up. The kid looks up the first offense box. The person behind the desk reminds them, no, move over. You should be looking at the second offense box. The consequence is critically important. But then you want to spend, this can be done in as little as 10 minutes. You want to engage in a reflective exercise with the kid. You want to call them over to the desk. And by the way, English teachers do this better than vice principals for discipline, because you can't do this with any anger. And English teachers seem to be better at doing it without anger than the dean of discipline. You call the kid over to the desk, and you have 4 questions for them. What did you do? And the kid, of course, always says, I didn't do anything. Nothing happened. What are you even talking? Why am I even in here? And in a calm kind of way, you just keep going over it as if you were helping the kid write an essay. And people who do this say very quickly, a kid will end up saying, what? So I tripped them? Okay, you tripped them. That's what you did. And then you want to say, what was wrong with that? And the kid says, what was wrong with it? Nothing was wrong with it. My God, I tripped him. So what? Big deal. And eventually and pretty quickly, the kid will say something like, he was limping when he got up, a big pretender, faker, but yeah, so maybe he was, he hurt his, you write that down as if you were constructing an essay. He was limping. His leg was hurt. Then you want to know, what problem were you trying to solve? You, the kid that bullied, that hurt the other kid. What problem did you have that you were trying to solve when you hurt this kid? And usually that one you get a response to, even though they don't like the language. And I think the problem I was trying to solve, well, what are you talking about? This kid, he's always in my face, or he's always leaning over my shoulder, or he bothers me, or the way he looks, it's disgusting, or when he does that, whatever the story is. And you say, okay, so you want, that's the problem you were trying to solve, that you don't want to be bothered or whatever it is, and you write it down. And the 4th question is some version of, what are you going to do the next time you have that problem? And you get an answer from the kid. You go through alternatives, you brainstorm with the kid, and you write that down as if it was an essay for English class, and you can write it for him or her, and the kid signs it. Meanwhile, you call the parent. I thought you would want to know. It's amazing the number of parents that don't get called when stuff is happening at school. And I talk with people in school sometimes, and they commonly say, the parent wouldn't respond appropriately, or we can't call this parent for whatever reason. And the experience of people is that when you call the parent and say, I thought you would want to know, mostly there's a positive response. I'm not talking about situations where there's histories of child abuse and neglect or things like that, but you do that. So that's I'm doing this very quickly, believe me, and not fully, but that's a version of what the 4-question process is. And if you want to know more about it, and maybe in some of the literal words I just used, I fully attribute it to Stan Davis, who is perhaps the country's best leading anti-bullying advocate from small rural Bean, Maine, and has this wonderful book, Schools Where Everyone Belongs.
All right, thank you for that. I know there was a lot to cover in that question.
Yeah.
Are New Jersey schools supposed to be trained in anti-bullying?
The fact is that there is some training going on. I shouldn't have said There is some training going on in the last few years in the sense that the Department of Education has contracted with Rutgers University, Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology, which is a very good place, and to do some contract work for it across the state on helping schools with their policies and to some extent helping schools with their actual programs. But there's this is grant money, it's soft money, it's basically, I'm advised, run out. There's very little structured sort of support, funding to do this kind of thing, and a new system for providing backup and support and training for schools is desperately needed. Having said that, the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, which is a key sponsor for the coalition out of its headquarters in New Brunswick at the Law Center, provides free, and you even get food, free training for school.
Even better, right?
Yeah, free training for school staff who want to come there and participate in trainings that they do all year long. And the training is a whole school model informed. It's conducted by Lisa Ann Smith, who is a wonderful trainer. New Jersey's lucky to have her. And she provides free training all year long on these issues for school staff that will come there. Another organization, New Jersey Child Assault Prevention out of South Jersey and Stuart, and I should say as a disclaimer that I'm on the advisory board of that, also does trainings in schools. They'll come to the school for a couple of days and do some training. They do charge for this service, sort of modest nonprofit type of amount. And of course, a school that had resources could bring in an outside program like the Olveus program. There's a U.S. Olveus team. The cost of that is up higher than I'm comfortable with, $7,000 to $10,000. And what you get is well informed. It's a little bit limited. It's not perfect. Of course, it's not for me to critique the Olveus program. This is the the founder of the entire field in which I'm advocating. But and again, I think the evidence suggests that these programs have to be homegrown. So it's really not a question of money, except of course time is money, and there needs to be some time devoted to this. But the fact that, I'm sorry, you want to interrupt me, and you
No,
can't.
I don't. You continue, please. Go ahead.
I just want to say again to emphasize this. This is the most important problem of the school-age child. I'm not saying it's more important than child abuse and neglect or sexual abuse or extreme poverty or, buildings falling down. But it's the most important common, very common problem of the school-age child. And we know now from studies that this has a tremendous impact on academic performance through that school engagement factor and those states of tension and so forth. Principals who get it would be addressing this like crazy starting tomorrow morning. There wouldn't be an inadequate approach to this problem in any school in the land. And it doesn't need to wait for increased funding even or support. A commitment by the school, by the school's professional learning community can begin to address this. And there is, as I said, some free help available. Now, having said that, I think it's very important that we retool in New Jersey in a structured way so that we have a new system in place that systematically provides expertise and support to all of the schools in the state. And I think we can do that even without significant or any additional funding. We have great state universities in New Jersey where there's expertise available and I think some ability to provide some consultation for schools. So I think that it's the commitment to address it that's needed more than any other single factor. And that's the major frustration for advocates, myself and others. The fact that, it's like in the women's movement, the idea is that there are men who get it and men who don't get it. And it's the same thing with the anti-bullying movement. There are principals and school officials who get it, and there are some who don't get it or don't get it enough. And that's the major barrier to addressing this issue. And only parents and communities agitating and creating more effort for schools to address this, more pressure. I just want to say, and I'll make this the last thing I say, and then I'll still answer questions, including for the next week if anybody emails, that sometimes we compare where we are in the anti-bullying movement to the civil rights movement in the early 60s. Just at the beginning, there were beginning laws, but not enough change. There was a growing awareness on the part of people being hurt that they were being hurt. There was growing anger about it. The population was more aware and upset about it. But we still were far from having any adequate action. In some ways, we haven't had adequate action on that issue to this day, in terms of the continuing segregation by economic status, if not by race per se. But that's where we are. We're at the beginning of this social movement in some sense, despite the fact that we have 3 laws in 43 states in the country that now have anti-bullying laws. Not strong enough yet, not enough meaningful action by schools in general, with some notable exceptions.
All right, Stuart. We have time for one more question, and this is probably a humdinger, so I'm just going to ask one more. So I hope that a lot of people are still hanging on, and we've only lost a few, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it. If anybody does have to leave, I want to invite you to be sure to fill out the survey that pops up on your screen if you can't stay on any longer. But the question is pertains to the fact that in a situation, the principal said that the child who was being bullied needed a psych evaluation to see if he is giving off signals to get bullied. And then, in fact, in the same situation, the superintendent also said that the child was giving off vibes. So I'd like you to spend a little bit of time on that kind of a label.
Sure. My immediate reaction is that it's outrageous, absolutely outrageous. Now, having said that, and being kind to this principal and district superintendent, who I completely don't know, right? The fact is that Olveus used a very unfortunate term. Maybe it's a Norwegian thing. I don't mean to malign Norwegians. But he used the term provocative victim to identify a smaller subset of kids who both bullied other kids and were bullied themselves. And the term provocative victim is a blaming term. It's a very bad term. But at the same time, we call them something not much better here in the States. We say bully victims, bully/victims. There are kids who flow across both of those roles, and who seem to, if you take them, 100 of them in one corner of the room, and 100 kids who only do one of those things in another corner of the room, and compare them, you have a higher percentage of problems, really, in those kids who are bully victims. And also, of course, there are kids who are hurt who you could identify some issues in. I mean, let's face it, there are kids, excuse me, with on the Asperger's or autistic spectrum disorders, who sometimes other kids will hurt. Did the Asperger's cause the bullying? Did the behavior cause the bullying? It's an outrageous suggestion. And the problem with recommending psychiatric evaluation or treatment for a kid who got hurt is, first of all, it's a problem of timing or sequence. In other words, can you imagine somebody getting mugged and they go into the police or they look for help, and the suggestion is made that they should have some evaluation to see if there was some way in which they attracted the mugger's attention. In fact, we have an exact analogous model for this. In the suggestion by many people, it was received wisdom for, horrible ages in the violence, an infamous element in the that advocates against violence to women will tell you, in which the suggestion is made that women who were sexually assaulted might have attracted the attention of the person who hurt them through some element of appearance or dress or some other kind of thing. And, studies have shown, of course, that that has nothing to do with anything. It's not a matter of appearance or how you behave when you are victimized. It's the fact of what was in the mind of the perpetrator. And in the mind of the perpetrator and in the social environment in which they operate is the entire cause of a child being hurt. And to suggest that a child or anyone being hurt, and to suggest to someone who's been hurt that now we're going to do psychiatric evaluation to see what it is about you that caused this, is an absolutely outrageous suggestion. If you want to help the child who's vulnerable psychiatrically or otherwise, you proactively find them prior to them being hurt, and you take steps to increase support for them, which may include some form of counseling or social skills training or something like that. But don't do it as your response to the incident. If you do that as your response to the incident, you're inevitably suggesting to that child and to that parent, and actually in what you just told me, which is even more outrageous, the example you gave is even more blatant, in which the principal and the superintendent are outright saying to this child and to this parent that their behavior caused the bullying. And it's not only outrageous, it's illogical, and it's not real. Because the fact is that what are you really saying? That a child who behaves in a certain way deserves to get hurt? That this is justified? That the response of somebody who hurt them is justified and okay because the child behaved in a certain way? What did that child do to cause this harm to come to them? And even if there was what Alveus unfortunately would have called some provocation, who said that the perpetrator, the kid who did the hurting, had to respond in that way? That was the only way that that kid could have responded? We seem to feel free to say to kids who get hurt that they should ignore or they should walk away. And those are outrageous suggestions by themselves. Telling a kid who's being bullied or who's afraid to walk away implies that they have control over the situation, which they mostly don't, and that there are certain parts of the territory where they can't go, but the bullies can walk freely where kids who bully can walk freely where they will. The whole thing is just, and telling a kid to ignore this experience, it's like telling a kid whose grandma died, to ignore the grief, get over it, make a joke about it. Being bullied is a grief experience for kids who get hurt. It smashes dreams. There are kids who get bullied who stay up all night thinking about this. There are kids who pray about it at night. Before they go to sleep, they ask God to, make something change in their lives. And they're doing this out of a sense of hopefulness. Maybe they're from a religious family or they're in a faith community. And they ask God to make something different the next day at school. And I've known kids who go to school the next day and get hurt all over again and lose faith. I think this is just a speculation on my part, but I think some of the problems we have with the unchurched or people who drop out of faith communities is because you go on Saturday or Sunday or whenever you go to the synagogue or the church or the mosque or whatever, and you hear all kinds of words from adults about peacefulness and good relations and all these kinds of things. And then you go into your school the next morning on Monday or whatever day it is, and you enter an atmosphere that's inadequately controlled for violence. And I think that hypocrisy, that contradiction is extremely corrosive on all levels. So I guess basically what I think is that the parent who was told this and the child to whom this was communicated experienced something absolutely outrageous and inappropriate and unacceptable. And it's infuriating to hear about it.
Well, Dr. Green, thank you. And on that note, I think we need to wrap it up. So I hope you'll take a deep breath now and a drink of water.
Sure.
And, when I talked to people ahead of this webinar and was, talking and inviting people, I told them you were very passionate about this, and that's pretty clear that you are. This is near and dear for you, and I so appreciate your time tonight. So with that, the webinar is over. I'm going to say good night. Kelly is going to pick up and handle a few housekeeping things at the end. And thank you very much. That was a great webinar.
Sure. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you all for joining us on our webinar on bullying. There is an exit survey which should show on your screen as you exit. Please fill out the evaluation. The discussion board is open and ready for your questions and will be available for the next 7 days on the NJCTS website. If you didn't get your question answered this evening, that website is www.njcts.org. An archived recording of tonight's webinar will also be posted on the site by the end of the week. Our next presentation is on navigating the emergency room, presented by Dr. Tolga Tonelli, and is scheduled for October 20th, 2010. This ends tonight's webinar. Thank you, Dr. Green, for your excellent presentation, and thank you, everyone,